At first glance, Emily Johnson was just another face in the background, a quiet presence in beige scrubs, moving unobtrusively through the marble halls of the prestigious Preston Music Conservatory in Boston. At 28, she blended into the scenery like the antique picture frames she carefully dusted each morning. Most people didn't notice the custodian with the ponytail and worn-out sneakers. And if they did, it was only because something needed cleaning. But if anyone had paused to look a little closer, they might have seen it, that faint, faraway spark in her eyes every time she passed the grand piano in the reception hall. That whisper of longing when her fingertips, still rough from disinfectants and cleaning solutions, brushed against polished brass or ivory keys left uncovered after a late-night rehearsal. Emily had worked at the conservatory for 3 years. She arrived early each morning, often before sunrise, and stayed until the last light faded from the stained glass windows. Her duties were straightforward: empty the trash bins, mop the hardwood floors, clean the restrooms, and make sure every inch of the place gleamed before the donors and professors arrived. She moved with quiet efficiency, never making a fuss, never stepping out of line. That's what was expected of her. What no one knew, what no one had even bothered to ask, was that Emily hadn't always been a custodian. 15 years earlier, she had sat at a Steinway herself, her legs barely reaching the pedals, as her grandmother guided her small hands across the keys. Her earliest memories were not of cartoons or playgrounds, but of Chopin nocturnes echoing through a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Worcester, Massachusetts, where she had grown up. Her grandmother, Margaret Johnson, had once played with the National Symphony in the 1970s. Arthritis had taken her career, but not her love of music, and certainly not her desire to pass it on. Emily showed promise early. By the age of 10, she was playing Liszt and Debussy, performing at local recitals and stunning audiences with her emotional depth and technical skill. By 17, she'd been accepted to Juilliard on merit, an achievement that could have changed the course of her life. But fate had other plans. Just weeks after the acceptance letter arrived, her grandmother suffered a debilitating stroke. With no one else to care for her, Emily walked away from her future, trading Carnegie Hall for a job at the local pharmacy to keep the lights on. Now, years later, her dreams were hidden beneath layers of routine and resignation. Still, there were moments, brief, stolen, when she allowed herself to remember. Late at night, after the last students had gone, she would sit at the unused practice room piano and let her fingers speak a truth she never dared say aloud. It wasn't for praise or applause. It was for herself and for the memory of the woman who had given her music. Emily didn't want pity. She didn't expect opportunity. She had come to terms with the life she was living. Or so she believed. At Preston Music Conservatory, image was everything. The hallways gleamed with imported Italian marble, oil portraits of long-dead composers lined the walls, and a sense of quiet prestige permeated every corner. It was a place where names mattered, names on plaques, names in programs, names in endowment lists. Emily Johnson's name, of course, was on none of them. To most of the faculty and students, she was little more than part of the decor, like a mop bucket tucked behind the stage curtain or a service door that quietly closed itself. Her uniform, a beige custodial outfit with Emily J. stitched above the breast pocket, might as well have been camouflage. It made her blend into the background, no matter how hard she worked. Each day brought small reminders of her place in their unspoken hierarchy. "Emily, those chairs need to be exactly 12 inches apart," snapped Margaret Sinclair, the conservatory's iron-willed director, without so much as making eye contact. Her voice echoed sharply across the reception hall, where preparations were underway for yet another high-profile donor event. "Yes, ma'am," Emily replied, already adjusting the spacing with a tape measure she kept clipped to her belt. She never argued, never sighed in frustration. The job would get done, perfectly, as always. From across the room, Karen Whitmore, the conservatory's star piano instructor, watched the exchange with a smug twist to her mouth. Tall, elegant, and always dressed in heels that echoed off the polished floors like a metronome, Karen had no patience for imperfection, especially from the help. "Margaret," she called out just loud enough to Carrie, "please remind the cleaning staff to use the service corridors once the guests arrive. Last time I saw one of them in the main hall during the Chopin competition. It was distracting." Emily heard it. She always heard it. These little public shames, delivered with a smile or a laugh, had become as routine as wiping down mirrors and scrubbing tile grout. Yet even amid the slights, Emily carried herself with quiet dignity. She kept her posture straight, her words polite, and her work meticulous. Not because anyone expected excellence from a custodian, but because she expected it of herself. One afternoon, as she polished the brass rail along the grand staircase, she paused outside a practice room where a young girl, perhaps 12, was struggling through a difficult run of arpeggios. The child's frustration was audible in each uneven note. Without thinking, Emily whispered gently, "Try relaxing your wrist on the upward motion." The girl startled and looked up, just as Karen entered behind her, her voice slicing through the room like ice. "Did you just attempt to coach my student?" "I'm sorry," Emily stammered, lowering her gaze. "I didn't mean to intrude." Karen's laughter was sharp. "Let's keep the cleaning staff focused on trash cans, not technique." The door closed firmly, and Emily returned to her work in silence. What Karen didn't see was the way Emily's fingers moved lightly against the brass railing, completing the phrase the student had fumbled, in perfect silence, note by imagined note. Each insult, each dismissal, was a quiet scar. But beneath it all, the music still lived in her. It waited. And sometimes, it fought to be heard. The morning of the gala arrived with a kind of frenetic energy that only accompanied large, donor-driven events. The Preston Music Conservatory sparkled under the lights of its crystal chandeliers, and the smell of fresh-cut peonies and lemon polish filled the air. For weeks, the staff had been preparing for this night, an annual fundraiser attended by Boston's wealthiest patrons and music benefactors. What was raised tonight would determine which programs thrived and which quietly faded away. Emily had started her day at 6 a.m., working through the long corridors with her usual quiet focus. By early afternoon, she had polished the brass banisters on the grand staircase, arranged the chairs in the main hall exactly 12 inches apart, as Mrs. Sinclair had demanded, and spot-checked the restrooms twice. The reception area gleamed. Even the Steinway grand piano, the centerpiece of the night's performance, had been wiped to a mirror shine. It was just before 5 p.m. when chaos erupted. The double doors to the main hall swung open, and Karen Whitmore stormed in, her high heels clicking furiously across the marble floor. Her face was tight with panic, one hand clutched around her cell phone. She wasn't alone for long. Margaret Sinclair was close behind her, pearl necklace clutched like a rosary in one hand. "What do you mean she's in the ER?" Karen's voice echoed sharply off the tall walls. She listened for a beat, then snapped, "Food poisoning? Now? The gala starts in less than an hour." Emily stood near the coat racks, wiping down a mirror, pretending not to hear. But she could feel the air shift. Something had gone terribly wrong. Karen ended the call with a huff and turned to Margaret. "Olivia's out. There's no way she's playing tonight. And none of my other students are even close to ready for Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2. Margaret's face blanched. The Jefferson Foundation requested that piece specifically. We built the whole second half of the program around it. From the edge of the room, Brian Carter, a young teaching assistant known for his respectful nods and quiet encouragement, stepped forward. "If I may," he said carefully, glancing between the two women, "I think there might be another option." Karen rolled her eyes. "Unless Professor Williams just walked in the door, I don't see how." Brian hesitated for only a moment before nodding toward the back of the room, toward Emily. "I've heard her play," he said, surprising even himself. "She's incredible." The room fell silent. Karen let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking." "The janitor?" "I'm not joking," Brian replied. "She plays that piece better than most of the graduate students. I've heard her, late at night, when she thinks no one's around." All eyes turned to Emily, who had frozen mid-polish. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the cloth. "Is this true?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp but curious. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I know the piece." The moment hung there, awkward, tense, surreal. Karen's voice oozed sarcasm. "Well, this should be entertaining." What began as a desperate search for a solution was turning into something else, a quiet reckoning, a moment no one had planned for. Emily didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change. Emily stood completely still, the soft cloth slipping from her fingers onto the marble floor. The grand reception hall buzzed around her, waiters adjusting trays, staff finalizing seating cards, but inside the small circle of attention, the world had narrowed. Karen Whitmore's smirk was unmistakable. "So let me get this straight," she said, arms folded. "You think the woman who just finished scrubbing the baseboards is going to step in and perform Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 for the Jefferson Foundation?" The sarcasm in her voice dripped like molasses. Emily met her gaze. "I've played it before." Margaret Sinclair, usually all business, squinted at Emily like she was seeing her for the first time. "And you believe you can deliver a performance worthy of our patrons?" "I believe I can play it with everything I have," Emily replied simply, her voice calm but firm. From across the room, William Bennett, chairman of the board and a man with a nose for opportunity, approached with curiosity. His navy blazer hung just right, and he had the practiced air of someone who'd attended hundreds of galas and remembered only the ones that made headlines. "What's going on here?" he asked, glancing between Margaret and Karen. "Our scheduled performer canceled last minute," Margaret explained, offering a tight smile. "And apparently, our custodian here thinks she can step in." William turned to Emily, scanning her from head to toe. His gaze lingered on her hands, still red from cleaning chemicals, still trembling slightly. "Well," he said slowly, "that's certainly unexpected." Karen leaned toward Margaret and William, dropping her voice just enough to seem polite but not so low that Emily couldn't hear. "It might actually work in our favor. Frame it as a community engagement story. If she's terrible, we chalk it up to desperation. If she's passable, we look generous for giving someone from the real world a shot." Emily's face remained expressionless, but inside, something flared. Anger? Embarrassment? No, it was something older, something deeper. The same feeling she'd had the day she tore up her Juilliard acceptance letter to care for her ailing grandmother. The quiet ache of sacrifice. "Emily," Margaret said, clearing her throat, "we'll allow you to perform one piece. The Hungarian Rhapsody. If you're as good as Brian claims, this could be a pleasant surprise for our guests." "And if I refuse?" Emily asked, not defiantly, but with quiet clarity. Karen raised an eyebrow. then we'll need to reevaluate your position here. You know how tight the budget's been." It wasn't a threat, it was a dismissal in the making, veiled as a choice. For a long beat, Emily didn't speak. Around her, the noise of final preparations carried on, glassware clinking, laughter in the distance, a string quartet warming up backstage. But in that moment, all she could hear was her grandmother's voice. "Music isn't about who you are to the world, sweetheart. It's about who you are when the world fades away." She drew in a breath and nodded. "I'll play." And just like that, the woman who had been invisible for 3 years was thrust into a spotlight that would either reveal her or consume her. The Grand Hall of the Preston Music Conservatory was a picture of elegance that evening. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, and rows of tuxedos and floor-length gowns stretched across the auditorium like waves of silk and satin. The buzz of conversation echoed against the marble pillars, mingling with the soft tuning of string instruments. Backstage, Emily Johnson stood alone, still wearing her beige custodial uniform. A name tag reading Emily J. was pinned over her heart, as out of place under the spotlights as rubber gloves in a jewelry case. She took a deep breath, trying to silence the pounding in her chest. All around her, the weight of doubt hung thick, most of it unspoken, but some unmistakably cruel. Karen Whitmore lingered in the wings, arms crossed, a look of gleeful anticipation playing at her lips. She wasn't expecting brilliance. She was expecting humiliation. Margaret Sinclair tapped the microphone, drawing the room to attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began with the ease of someone used to commanding a room full of donors, "we've had a slight change to our program this evening. Our scheduled performer, Madison Brooks, experienced a medical emergency and will not be joining us. However, in the spirit of community outreach, we have a surprise performance from one of our own staff." A polite murmur rippled through the audience. "Please welcome Ms. Emily Johnson." As Emily walked across the stage, the spotlights felt like judgment beams. A few scattered chuckles rose from the back rows. Someone in the third row whispered, "She's the janitor, right?" Emily sat down at the gleaming Steinway grand piano. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy black surface, nervous, uncertain, but resolute. She closed her eyes and placed her hands gently on the keys. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then she played the first note. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't cautious. It was bold, clear, controlled. The opening bars of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 rang out not like a beginner's guess, but like a declaration. Her fingers danced across the keys with a confidence born of years of quiet practice, of passion kept alive in secret. In the front row, William Bennett sat up straighter. A few heads turned. Whispers hushed. The playful sections of the piece bubbled like champagne. The slower, melancholic interludes sang with a tenderness that felt almost too personal to witness. And then came the storm, the wild, demanding flourishes Liszt was known for, played with fire and precision, as if Emily had composed them herself. Karen's smirk faded. Margaret's pearl necklace hung still against her chest. And then, silence. Not a sound when the final thunderous chord faded into the rafters. For 3 full seconds, the audience remained frozen, as if afraid to exhale. Then came the applause. It started slowly, tentative, like disbelief. But it built into a roaring standing ovation that shook the room. Cries of "Bravo!" echoed off the walls. The same people who had barely noticed her before were now clapping with tears in their eyes. Emily stood, offered a humble bow, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to smile, not because they were applauding, but because she had finally been heard. And seen. As the final echoes of applause faded into the high-arched ceiling of the concert hall, Emily stood beside the piano, breathless, not from the performance, but from the wave of emotion crashing over her. The ovation still rang in her ears, yet part of her felt strangely detached, as if watching the scene unfold from outside her body. Before she could slip quietly off the stage, a voice called out from the front of the hall. "Wait, young lady." It was Charles Morgan, the esteemed conductor and special guest of the evening. He stepped forward, clapping his hands slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on hers. "Where did you study?" Emily turned back toward the spotlight. She hesitated. Her eyes darted to Margaret Sinclair and Karen Whitmore, both frozen near the curtain, unsure whether to be stunned or defensive. "I didn't," she replied softly. "Not formally." A murmur swept through the room. The disbelief was palpable. Charles looked skeptical, but intrigued. "That's impossible. Your phrasing, your command of tempo, your dynamic expression, those don't come from YouTube tutorials." Emily straightened slightly. "My grandmother taught me. At home. On a second-hand upright piano with a sticky G key." "What was her name?" "Margaret Johnson." Charles blinked. A moment of recognition flickered across his face. The Margaret Johnson? Played with the National Symphony in the 70s? Performed under Bernstein at Tanglewood? Emily nodded slowly. That was her. A new hush fell over the room, this one reverent. Margaret Sinclair, ever the professional, recovered quickly and stepped up to the microphone, smiling with polished ease. "Well, what a fascinating story. A true testament to how music can touch all walks of life." But Emily, still standing near the piano, didn't let the narrative get twisted. "It's not a story," she said. "It's my life." The simplicity of her words silenced the room more effectively than any dramatic speech. She looked directly at Karen now, voice steady. "I was accepted into Juilliard at 17. Full merit scholarship. I had a place waiting." Karen's jaw tightened. "But the same week my acceptance letter came," Emily continued, "my grandmother had a stroke. She couldn't care for herself, and we had no other family. I stayed. Gave up the offer. Took a job at the pharmacy to cover her medication." Even Charles Morgan looked visibly moved now. When she passed, there were medical bills. Time had gone by. It felt too late to start again. But I still needed to be near music, somehow. So, I took a job here. There was no trace of bitterness in her voice, only quiet strength. A kind of dignity that didn't need approval to exist. From the side of the stage, Brian Carter stood watching, pride evident in his eyes. He had known, if not the whole story, then at least enough to believe in her when no one else had. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't just a woman who emptied trash bins or wiped down music stands. In the eyes of everyone present, she had become something else entirely, an artist, a person of sacrifice, a reminder of the dreams we tuck away when life gets hard. And in that moment, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was unforgettable. After the performance, the grand reception hall buzzed with a different kind of energy, no longer the stiff politeness of donor chatter, but genuine excitement, even awe. Patrons who had spent years walking past Emily Johnson without so much as a glance now clustered nearby, eager to meet the woman whose music had just left them breathless. An older woman in a velvet shawl, one of the conservatory's top benefactors, reached for Emily's hand. "Your interpretation of the middle passage was simply exquisite," she said, her eyes glassy with emotion. "You brought something to it I haven't heard in decades, not since my late husband and I heard Horowitz perform in New York in '79. Emily smiled politely, still unsure how to respond to this sudden attention. A moment ago, she'd been wiping fingerprints off a mirror. Now, people were quoting concert hall legends to her. At the refreshment table, Karen Whitmore stood alone, no longer surrounded by admiring students or donors. Her carefully cultivated air of superiority had wilted. Across the room, the students she once mentored had gathered around Emily, asking questions, offering praise, some even asking if she taught lessons. Just then, Charles Morgan returned, this time accompanied by a woman in a tailored suit, Rachel Monroe, director of the Jefferson Foundation. She introduced herself with a warm handshake. "Miss Johnson," she began, "our foundation has long believed in nurturing talent that lives outside traditional boundaries. We've been quietly developing a new initiative called Music Within Reach, a program that brings high-level music instruction to underprivileged youth in urban and rural communities." Rachel exchanged a glance with Charles, then added, "We're looking for someone to lead it, someone with both exceptional musical skill and first-hand understanding of life's challenges. Someone like you." Emily blinked, momentarily stunned. "You want me to lead it?" "Yes," Rachel said with a nod. "It would include teaching, performing, and helping identify young talent that might otherwise go unnoticed. We believe your story, and your gift, could inspire thousands." For a moment, Emily didn't know what to say. Just a few hours ago, she'd been considering whether her job might be eliminated. Now, she was being offered a chance not just to return to music, but to transform lives through it. Off to the side, William Bennett observed the scene quietly. The power dynamics had shifted. People now spoke to Emily with respect, admiration. She had changed nothing about who she was, only revealed a part of herself they'd never bothered to see. Margaret Sinclair approached Rachel and Charles, her professional smile back in place. "Of course, we always knew there was more to Emily," she said smoothly. "Our community outreach programs have been quite effective at uncovering hidden gems." But Emily said nothing. She didn't need to correct the record. The applause, the offer, and the faces of those who now truly saw her, those spoke louder than any retort ever could. She looked down at her calloused hands, still slightly dry from years of cleaning solutions. Hands that had once been judged as unworthy now held the future, for herself, and for countless children waiting to be heard. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slip away. 3 months later, the corridors of Preston Music Conservatory looked much the same, but for Emily Johnson, everything had changed. She still arrived early each morning. She still walked the same polished marble floors and passed the same framed portraits of long-gone composers. But now, she carried sheet music instead of a mop, and the name stitched to her blouse no longer read Emily J. on a custodial uniform. It was embroidered on a navy blue jacket as part of her official role with the Jefferson Foundation's Music Within Reach program. Her days were no longer spent in silence. Now, they were filled with the sound of possibility, young voices, hesitant notes on second-hand pianos, and laughter echoing through practice rooms once reserved for the privileged. In the conservatory's East Wing, a classroom had been converted into a rehearsal space for underserved youth from Boston's inner-city neighborhoods. These students had never taken private lessons. Most had never touched a real piano until now. But Emily saw something in their eyes she recognized: hunger. Not for food, but for expression. For a chance. She greeted each of them with the same quiet kindness that once carried her through years of invisibility. Today, she would show them not only how to play music, but how to believe they had a right to. "My grandmother used to tell me," she said as she sat down at the upright piano in the corner of the room, that music isn't about who you are to the world. It's about who you are when the world fades away. 8 pairs of eyes watched her hands. Some skeptical, some wide with hope. Then she played, not for an audience, not for applause, but to remind herself, and them, that music still lived in quiet places. The notes danced through the room, imperfect and warm. And in those moments, it didn't matter that her stage wasn't Carnegie Hall. She was making music that mattered. Across the conservatory, faculty and staff had begun to view her differently. There were still lingering traces of old assumptions. Those things didn't vanish overnight, but there was also a growing respect. Margaret Sinclair now greeted her with a nod that carried something close to recognition. Karen Whitmore, once openly dismissive, had become noticeably silent in meetings where Emily's work was praised. But Emily wasn't seeking revenge or validation. She was building something far more lasting. Each time a student reached a breakthrough, a clean scale, a well-timed crescendo, she saw the glimmer of her younger self in them. Not the girl who lost her chance, but the girl who still dared to dream, even when no one was looking. And though she never sought the spotlight, invitations began to come anyway: community concerts, guest lectures, even a radio interview on public broadcasting. But Emily remained grounded. She knew that true recognition wasn't in applause. It was in creating opportunity for others, especially those who'd been overlooked like she had. She often thought of her grandmother during quiet moments, how Margaret's hands, stiff with arthritis, had taught her to listen closely, to feel every note. That gift had carried Emily through the darkest times. Now, she was passing it on. Because sometimes, the most beautiful music doesn't come from grand stages or glittering gowns. Sometimes, it comes from someone who was once invisible, finally being heard. Emily Johnson's story reminds us that life doesn't always unfold the way we planned, but that doesn't mean it has lost its meaning. Many of us, especially as we grow older, carry dreams we set aside for the sake of others, raising families, caring for aging parents, making practical choices over passionate ones. Sometimes those sacrifices feel invisible, even forgotten. But as Emily's journey shows, our talents, our passions, and our purpose don't disappear, they wait. They wait quietly beneath the surface, ready to shine when the time is right. Whether it's music, art, storytelling, or simply the wisdom we've gained from life's trials, we each have something valuable that the world needs. This story is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to rediscover a part of ourselves that was put on hold. We are never too old to inspire, to teach, or to begin again. Recognition may come in unexpected ways or at unexpected times, but our worth is not defined by titles or status. It's revealed in the courage to be authentic, to stay kind in the face of dismissal, and to believe in what still lives within us. So whether you're 55 or 85, remember this: your story isn't over. There may be someone out there who needs to hear your song, learn from your journey, or feel seen because you chose to step forward. Like Emily, perhaps your greatest chapter is yet to be played. Because sometimes, the most beautiful melodies come from the quietest corners, and from those who refuse to give up on themselves.